for this next segment, we're going to actually demonstrate what it sounds like to modulate the standard VCO, but this time around we're going to use the high frequency, or the audible frequency, of the A145. Now if you need a little refresher on what that sounds like, I'm going to bring the level down of our square wave. That's this one right here. I'm going to bring that down a little bit, and I'm going to feed in our audible oscillator, so just so we can hear what that's going to sound like. And this just happens to be a saw wave. I'm just sort of arbitrarily picking it, and I'm going to patch it into input 2 of our mixer, and we should hear this waveform. So we're going to use this as a modulation source, and this is going to be going into CV1. Okay. So that's our normal sound source, and we're going to use this to modulate the pulse width of the standard VCO. So we should hear something very, very different this time around. So I'm going to patch that in. There we go. And I'm going to bring the level up. Definitely have a different sound going on this time. And I can adjust the setting on my pulse width on the standard VCO to change my sound just a little bit, or I can adjust the frequency of the LFO to modulate it in a slightly different place. And so this is still considered modulation, it's just now the oscillator here, the LFO, is operating in the audible range and modulating at pulse width CV1. This is creating something called sidebands, if you're interested. So I can bring my frequency all the way up. And then I'm going to bring up my pulse width over here, so I can hear what that sounds like a little bit different. Okay. Bring it back to about the midpoint. I'm going to unpatch the saw wave, and we're not going to go through all the waves, just maybe 2 or 3 more. Let's try the sine wave. There we go. So sine wave at audible rate, modulating the pulse width of CV1. And then I can bring my frequency up to about the 12 o'clock position. Maybe adjust my pulse width a little bit. Maybe bring my frequency down a little bit. And I just kind of adjust it to the taste of what I want my waveform to sound like. So that's our sine wave. Let's go on to the triangle wave. So we're about the 10, 11 o'clock position on the frequency. Let's maybe try it over at the 2 o'clock position. Let's just go nuts all the way to the max. Okay, now unpatch that. And let's wrap up on demonstrating CV1 and jump right into CV2. So I'm going to patch cable at pulse width CV1, and we're going to patch into CV2. And let's start at the bottom. So we'll go with a square wave to use as a modulation source. And again, it's in the very, very high setting. Let's bring our CV2 level all the way down. I patch my square wave. So I'm just hearing dry square wave, not being modulated at all. And then as I bring my level of CV2 up, I start to get that modulation with an audio rate oscillator going into the pulse width of the standard VCO. And I can adjust the frequency of my LFO to get a slightly different timbre. Or I can now adjust the level of my input of modulation until I find something that I'm kind of fond of. Let's try the frequency down some. Okay, moving right along. Let's go to Triangle Wave, because we haven't played around with him for a little while. There we go. So it's Triangle Wave at audio rate, modulating at CV2. Frequency on the LFO is about 9 o'clock or so. And then level of the pulse width modulation is about at the same, about 10 o'clock. So I can bring the level up, increase the amount of modulation coming in at CV2, or I can of course bring it down to the point where there's no more modulation. Okay, we're going to do one more waveform and then we'll demonstrate modulating both of these at the same time. So we didn't do the inverted saw, so let's do the inverted saw. There we go, patched, and we don't hear anything because our pulse width's all the way down. Pulse width modulation's all the way down over here. So bringing it up slightly, I'm going to bring it to about the midpoint. And now let's go in and adjust our frequency. So right now we're at the 9 o'clock position. Let's go up to about the 12 o'clock position. Let's try about 3 o'clock. Okay. So there you have it. Pulse width modulation in the low audio rate at pulse width CV1 and pulse width CV2, and then pulse width modulation occurring with an audio rate oscillator at CV1 and CV2. So now let's hear what it sounds like with a little bit of both. I'm not going to go through all the waveforms, just a few of them. So I'm going to do, let's start with a saw, going into pulse width CV1. And then for my second waveform, I'm going to choose a triangle wave. And I'm going to go into pulse width CV2, but I'm going to bring the level of CV2 all the way down. So there, now I have two waveforms being patched into the two pulse width CV inputs. And now I'm going to increase the level of pulse width CV2. Okay, so now we have two waveforms going into standard VCO. And then, so what's happening with these is both of these waveforms are being piped in to pulse width, they're being added together, and then they're going to the pulse width and modulating it then after they're summed together. And then I can adjust the flavor by just kind of adjusting the setting. Or I still have the ability to go in and adjust the pulse width. And that tells it that I want that particular setting modulated right now. And now I can go into my frequency and adjust that if I want to. So if I want something a little slower, just a little bit. Let's bring pulse width CV2 amount just down a little bit. Okay, so there we have two waveforms going into pulse width CV1 and pulse width CV2. First one's a saw wave going into CV1, and then second one's a triangle wave going into pulse width CV2. The amount of modulation coming in at CV2 is around the 10 o'clock position, and our frequency is over here somewhere in the low section of the LFO. So let's hear what it sounds like if we just flip it over to the audio rate. Okay, so I can flip up the amount of CV2, adjust the frequency. Or I can flip back to a low mode. And we haven't done a lot of this, but I could even flip it over to the midpoint of the LFO. There is one more setting over here we haven't explored too much. Sort of a nice in-between. And I can adjust my frequency rate. I can adjust my pulse width. So there we have a little demonstration of modulation occurring at CV1 and CV2 at the same time. And then what it sounds like in the low range, high range, and then we even did a little bit of middle. Okay. And then for the last demonstration of pulse width modulation, before we go into the next section, discussing filters over here, we're going to do just a little brief demo of something called cross modulation. You may have noticed that there's another VCO sitting right over here. And so the second VCO is going to be what we use to facilitate this demonstration. So let's talk about what cross modulation is. Cross modulation occurs when one oscillator modulates another. So that's what we're going to set up here. One oscillator modulating another. Well, you say, well, why is that different? We've been doing that. We've been using LFO going to here and modulating it. Cross modulation goes one step further. So you have an oscillator modulating another, and then that the one being modulated, I should say, is going to then modulate the first one back. So it's like they're kind of in this little circle modulating themselves. So let's patch this and hear what it sounds like. Let's see, which waveform should we use? Let's start with a triangle wave because that's my favorite. And we're going to patch into CV1 of the standard VCO. And let's hear what that sounds like. And on this one, let's use something different like a sine wave. And patch that in. So there we have triangle wave over here, patching into CV1 of the standard VCO. And that's again going into the pitch part of the standard VCO. And I can adjust the range of my VCO if I want to get a slightly different flavor. I can adjust the range of this one too. Alright, so now we're going to set up the cross modulation part, because this for the most part sounds very similar to what we had when we modulated the VCO with an audio rate LFO. So we're going to take a waveform from here. Let's do a triangle wave. And we're going to patch it into, well, let's do CV2. And we'll turn the level all the way down so we can slowly bring in the cross modulation. Okay, so there, our cross modulation is happening, but we haven't brought up the level yet. So I'm going to bring it up. We don't have full cross modulation yet. We have about mid-range. And that's a fairly unexpected sound. Let's bring it back to about the midpoint until I get something that I particularly like. There we go. Fairly interesting sound for sure. So that's a little demonstration of cross modulation. And so now, since we're demonstrating that, and we are at the end of our segment, let's just go a little bit nuts, and we'll modulate a little bit more. So I'm going to actually bring our friend A145 in the low rate, and I'm going to take a sine wave, and I'm going to go ahead and modulate CV2 of the second A110. So now our cross modulation sound is a little bit broken, so to speak. But we actually got 3 oscillators involved now. And if we want to get back to our cross modulated sound, we can just bring that all the way back down. And I can even take another waveform from here, like a saw. Maybe go into pulse width, well, not pulse width, because we don't have a square wave from over here. But let's go into CV1 over here. So now let's try manually adjusting frequency and see what we get. And then I can adjust the range. That one I went down to about the +1 setting, go to 0 setting. Bring this one up, maybe. Let's bring the frequency all the way up. Okay, so that was our little demonstration of cross modulation with our 2 oscillators. And cross modulation is when one oscillator modulates another oscillator, and then the second oscillator, the one that's being modulated, then goes back and modulates the first oscillator. This time around, we threw in a little bit of excitement and got all 3 of them involved here. And so that's going to wrap up this segment on pulse width modulation, and then of course the little cross modulation surprise I threw in. In the next segment, we're going to be showing a little bit of what the filters do here and how we can use them to enhance the sounds of the standard VCOs, and maybe even show a little bit about how we can use an A145 as a modulation source to change the way that the filter behaves in respect to the standard VCO. So stay tuned.